Thank you. It's an honor to be here today to share this commemoration with you. As have many other speakers, I want to start with a few words of thanks to my friends Yvette and Gatan and the organizing committee for their invitation to have the opportunity to share this important event with you. Thank you as well to the Rwandan Embassy for their role in organizing much of what we're doing today and tomorrow as well. And thank you mostly to you. It is amazing to see such an incredible group of people come together to commemorate this event 18 years later. Thank you for your commitment to being here. Thank you for your patience, which is soon to be rewarded because I'm the next to last speaker before we get to take our first break for the afternoon. What I would like to do is take the title of my presentation, "We No Longer Saw a Human Being," to frame it in the context of some of what I'd like to talk about in terms of truth-telling and genocide denial. My work involves the field of the psychology of perpetrator behavior. For close to 20 years, I have spent a great majority of my time working with perpetrator testimony, beginning with archival research from perpetrators from the Holocaust and beyond, and continuing over the past several years with face-to-face interviews with alleged and convicted perpetrators in places as diverse as Northern Ireland, Argentina, the former Yugoslavia, and most recently in Rwanda. I take the title of my comments today from a quote from one of the perpetrators we've interviewed in Rwanda. One of the things you learn early on in working with perpetrator testimony is that the default reaction is always lies and it's evasion. And it takes a lot of work to get to some point of truth, to mine the truth from these testimonies. But when asked the question, how did you come to think it was right to kill? How did you kill the number of people you killed? And this particular perpetrator had killed and raped so many Tutsi that he could not, by his own admission, remember the exact number. And he said very simply, "We no longer saw a human being." And I think in the midst of all the lies that we're faced with often in working with perpetrators, that may be the biggest truth told to me ever by a perpetrator. We no longer saw a human being. So what I'd like to do, next slide please, is organize both my attention and your attention for the next several minutes around these four questions. What is the impact of truth-telling on peace building? What is the relationship of truth-telling to genocide denial? What is the relationship specifically of perpetrator truth-telling to genocide denial? And then finally, what do we stand to learn, if anything, from perpetrator truth-telling? Next. First, what's the impact of truth-telling on peace building? Just very quickly, we have a wide range of research over the past decades that has tried to unpack this relationship between truth-telling in societies torn by violent conflict and how that relates to peace building. We have some suggestions that, among other things, truth-telling encourages social healing and reconciliation. It promotes justice. It allows for the establishment of an official historical record. It serves an important public education function, which we too often neglect. It aids institutional reform. It helps promote democracy and stabilize societies in political transition. And finally, truth-telling preempts as well as deters future atrocities. Now, I want to be clear that we're unsure in some ways about the mechanics of how truth-telling is related to these functions. And we don't necessarily see truth-telling in a causal relationship to these positive aspects of peace building. But what we do seem to know is that truth-telling, however vaguely we understand it, is related to these very important pieces of peace building, especially in societies that have been torn by violent conflict. Next, please. So what is the relationship of truth-telling to genocide denial? I think first, and we've heard this several times today, we recognize that genocide denial is an affront to the truth. It is an enemy of the truth, and it's a hindrance to peace building. But I think much of what we've heard here today challenges us to turn that around a little bit, and to think less about what genocide denial does to the truth, and for us to think more about what the truth does to genocide denial. The truth is an enemy to genocide denial. The truth is in many ways an antidote to genocide denial. So where does truth come from? Next, please. I think truth-telling, we recognize, and we've heard today, comes from a lot of sources. It comes from survivors. It comes from bystanders, both in country and outside of country. It comes from historical records. It comes from judicial records. It even comes from crime scenes. But what we have to face today is kind of the challenge that, as uncomfortable as it may be, truth can also come from perpetrators. It doesn't come easily, and it often doesn't come without disguise. But I would argue that the truth that perpetrators can tell us about the atrocities they've committed is there. And it takes hard work to mine, and it takes hard emotional effort and strong emotional effort to confront. But I think in doing so, it tells us a lot about issues of genocide and particularly denial. Next, please. What is the relationship of perpetrator truth-telling to genocide denial? Next. I want to talk about this along 3 lines: for the perpetrators, for the victims, and also for society. For perpetrators who choose or can be talked into truth-telling, they begin to understand what they have done and the implications of their actions on their victims. It will come as no surprise to most of you when I tell you that the vast majority of Hutu perpetrators I've interviewed, when asked the simple question, "Why did you kill?" the most common response is, "It was a bad government. It was a bad time. I had no choice but to kill." I think we recognize the lie behind those responses. Because as someone said previously, the fact is most Hutu chose not to kill. They found reasons, some out of valor, some out of other less common or more base reasons, but they found reasons not to kill. So the answer for a perpetrator to say, "I killed because it was a bad government, because I had no choice to, because I was following orders," is an answer that perpetrators have used as far back as people have committed evil. But it's not truth-telling. And because it's not truth-telling, it doesn't help perpetrators to understand what they have done, and it doesn't help them to see the implications of their actions on the victims. When you speak with victims, whether it's Rwanda or elsewhere, and you ask, "What would you like to hear from perpetrators?" what they say is, "We want perpetrators to know what impact their violence had on us, what we've lost, what we'll never recover, how we do not sleep at night, how the trauma has affected not just us, but our children, and will affect our children's children. That the effects of what they have done and have perpetrated by their own choice, those effects will be generational. Those will linger for generations." Again, for perpetrators who do not tell the truth, they will never come to understand the implications of what they've done on their victims' lives. Next, please. For the victims, I think perpetrator truth-telling is important because it's part of establishing justice. It's part of signifying remorse and regret. The most common thing that I hear from survivors of genocide is simply that we wish perpetrators would tell the truth and do so with some sense of remorse and regret. One of the most common questions I get about my work in Rwanda is often from survivors who will say, in interviewing Hutu who have been alleged or convicted of genocide, have they ever expressed remorse? And the sad answer is yes. Each of them express remorse. But most often the remorse they express is for the situation they find themselves in. That they're in prison, that they lost farms, they can't go back to their communities. Needless to say, that's not the type of remorse from which survivors and the rest of the world are looking from perpetrators. But perpetrators who tell the truth and signify remorse and regret, I would argue, could be an important move toward healing. Now, because it happens so seldom in terms of perpetrator truth-telling and remorse and regret, we don't really know how far it can push healing, but I'm going to argue that I think it can. And then thirdly, next please, for society, perpetrator truth-telling can heal. It doesn't have to divide. And I think often in post-conflict societies where we're afraid of perpetrator truth-telling is to hear the stories brings up the pain and very often starts to feel divisive. But I would argue at some point that division can turn into healing. At some point, perpetrator truth-telling can be part of, not the only thing, but part of ending a culture of impunity. That perpetrator truth-telling, when done sincerely and with remorse and regret, can be a part of fostering reconciliation. And I think in the long run, perpetrator truth-telling helps prevent genocide denial. And when the perpetrators themselves confess to what they did, how they did it, why they did it, that's a truth. It's a truth that stands in direct opposition to those who would argue that the genocide never occurred. Next, please. And then fourth and finally, what can we learn from perpetrator truth-telling? Who they killed, where they killed, when they killed, because most of that's well documented. I'm interested in the deeper questions of why, the deeper questions of motivation. I think that's an important part of truth-telling. And my work over the years has convinced me, and this is kind of the central argument of what I do, that it's ordinary people like you and me who commit genocide and mass killing. And that's an important truth I think we can take from perpetrator truth-telling. We want to think, because it's comfortable, next please, that monstrous acts are only done by monsters. And in truth, there are some monstrous acts in genocide that are done by people that look like they're the living manifestations of our worst nightmares. But most of us recognize that the vast majority of monstrous acts are not done by monsters. They're done by ordinary people, very much like you and I. This is a difficult argument to admit, to understand, to absorb, because it has implications for how we think of ourselves. It has implications for how we think of our place in the world. So the question becomes, if it's ordinary people like you and I who do this type of extraordinary evil that we see in cases of genocide, how do they go about doing this? What is the process by which they become capable of this evil? Next, please. This is a quote from a perpetrator interviewed by Jan Hatzfeld, a French journalist. So a different sample of perpetrators than those with whom I've worked in Rwanda. But this perpetrator, when questioned by Hatzfeld, said this: "At the time of those murders, I didn't even notice the tiny thing that would change me into a killer. I've spent the largest part of my professional life trying to understand those tiny things that transform ordinary people into killers. And I think there are important reasons to do so, but because if we can't understand those tiny things, the why that lays behind why people commit these atrocities, we have no hope of stopping them." Next, please. This is not the time to take time to spend here on this model, but this is a part of the explanation that I've tried to lay out from a psychological perspective of what are the tiny things, and I've published in Becoming Evil, what are the tiny things that transform ordinary people into people capable of these atrocities. Next, please. And then finally, three things I want to conclude with. Next. First, to explain the behavior of perpetrators of genocide, we have to be clear as not to excuse the behavior. To understand why people come to do what they do in the face of genocidal violence when they perpetrate evil is not to forgive them. Evil doing itself is reprehensible, but I would argue we can't make the mistake of thinking it's incomprehensible. If we're faced with a deadly virus that threatens to wipe out our entire community, none of us would encourage the medical community to simply put its collective hands behind its back and say, my, what terrible destruction this virus is perpetrating on this community. We want to know what the virus is and where it comes from. Why? Because that's the only chance we have of stopping it. I would argue the same thing about perpetrators of genocide. As uncomfortable as it is to understand those tiny things that make them capable of this evil, the tiny choices they make, we have to understand them. We have to make the incomprehensible comprehensible if we have any hope of trying to stop it. Next, please. Secondly, Understanding the needs that are fulfilled by evil doing, whether they're psychological needs, physical needs, or emotional needs, can also help us understand how to fulfill these needs in less destructive ways. I think all perpetrators are doing the evil they do because it fulfills some needs for them that have not been fulfilled in other ways, or it fulfills some needs in greater ways than have been fulfilled in other ways. When we think about protection and prevention, I think we can think about it from the standpoint of what type of needs are fulfilled by evil doing that we as societies can figure out how to fulfill in healthier, more constructive, less destructive ways. And then finally, next please. Ultimately, truth-telling, I would argue, is necessary, but not sufficient. In other words, we need to have it, but it's not the only thing we need to have. It's a necessary but not sufficient mechanism for achieving reconciliation and lasting peace after violent conflict. I was in Argentina last month, and March 24th of every year, Argentinians commemorate the coup of March 24th, 1976, when a military regime came to power and over the next 7 years disappeared 30,000 people. A small number of people in a country of 25 million, but inflicted a regime of terror for 7 years that really affected everyone in Argentina. Argentinians are fond of saying, nunca más, never again, belongs to us. It's not simply about the Jewish experience in the Holocaust, that never again belongs to our suffering as well. I think one of the great lessons for us at the commemoration today is never again belongs to all of us. And truth-telling is an essential part of making that never again a reality. Thank you.